Welcome, everyone. Good morning. My name is Kristen Coran-Fuller. I'm the Associate Director of the Fair Housing Center, and I have the honor of welcoming you today to the 11th Annual Fair Housing Center's Breakfast. Whether you are here today in person or joining us on the live stream, thank you all for being here this morning. This event would not be possible without the support of our this year's silver and bronze sponsors. I'm going to read them all to you now. Our silver sponsors are the Fifth Third Bank, Old National Bank, and the Washtenaw County Office of Community and Economic Development. Our bronze sponsors, let's give them a round of applause. Our bronze sponsors today are the Bank of Ann Arbor, Delta Dental, the Greater Metropolitan, I can't say that. Board of Realtors, the Ann Arbor chapter, thank you. Key Bank, Lake Michigan Credit Union, the Michigan Realtors, University Bank, Zillow, and Zingerman's Community of Businesses. Thank you all. I also want to acknowledge our individual sponsors, all of our members, and all of today's attendees. On behalf of our past, current, and future complainants, the board of directors, and our staff, thank you for your continued commitment to equal housing opportunity. We could not do this work without you. Now I'm pleased to welcome our founding Fair Housing Board member and board president, Ann Rout, to the microphone.
Welcome everyone, and thank you, Kristen. It's always great to come to this event. I always get to see so many friends and the many representatives of our community partners and all of the allies of the Fair Housing Center and our work. As Kristen said, this is our 11th annual event, and this tradition has firmly taken hold as an opportunity for us to come and gather to celebrate the work of the Fair Housing Center, but also to have a communal learning experience, and we're going to have that today with our guest speaker. So it's a way to advance the work of our organization and to improve and continue to develop and work on our struggle to end systemic and individual discriminatory housing practices and to undo its many impacts on our community. The Fair Housing Center opened in 1992. Our mission is to end discrimination in housing and public accommodations and to promote accessible, integrated communities. The organization has continued to grow in its reach and impact, starting from one that just served Washtenaw County to now serving 9 counties across South and Central Michigan. And we now have a satellite office in Lansing. But that work requires trained staff, supported volunteers, and critical outreach and education in the materials to distribute across those 9 counties. So while the organization is largely supported by grants, it's important that we have events like this and that we have the support of our donors to sustain the foundation of the work of this organization. So that's why I am up here talking to you today. We set a goal of raising $50,000 at this event, and I believe we're at, when I last checked, we're at around $44,000. We're getting there. So it's my understanding that if our attendees each give $60, we can bridge that gap and reach our goal. There is a QR code on the back of your program, and if you go to that, it'll take you directly to the donations page. So it's my hope that you can all join me as I add to my previous donation, and we can get that firm $50,000 to move the organization forward into this next year. So thank you for your support today. Now I'd like to take a quick moment to introduce and recognize our Executive Director, Pam Kish. Pam has been here from the beginning of the Washtenaw Fair Housing Center, having previously worked at the Fair Housing Center of Metropolitan Detroit, before working with others to create what is now the Fair Housing Center of South and Central Michigan. She has led the organization through its struggles. There were times where staff was working part-time or not working at all because finances were so stretched. And through its growth, its tremendous growth as we're having right now, being able to really extend the impact of our work. But she's never allowed the organization to stray from its mission. So it's a real pleasure to introduce and bring forward Pam Kish and have an opportunity to thank her for another year of amazing work. Look on those QR codes.
Thank you, Anne. As mentioned before, Anne, before we even started the organization, Anne was on the board that we had to set up before we could actually become an organization. So Anne's been with us for 33 years. It's my pleasure to introduce Cashauna Hill, today's speaker. Cashauna started her fair housing work in law school, where she worked at Tulane's Fair Housing Clinic, and she later worked as a legal aid attorney after law school in Portland, Oregon, where she worked exclusively on fair housing cases. She moved to New Orleans, Louisiana, where she became the legal director of the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center, and was later tapped to be their executive director. At the Fair Housing Center in New Orleans, she led a team working to end discriminatory housing policies and practices through litigation, policy advocacy, community-based education, and other direct services responding to the immediate needs of the community. As an advocate, leader, and litigator with personal connections to the impacts of residential segregation and exclusionary housing policy, her work included leading the community engagement process for the City of New Orleans 2016 Assessment of Fair Housing Plan, the first in the nation submitted under the 2015 rule requiring state and local governments to identify and address barriers to fair housing choice. Today, she is the director of the Redress Movement, an organization created by Ted Shaw, director of the North Carolina Center for Civil Rights. And the organization was created in response to Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law. And many of us probably were here when Richard Rothstein was our speaker. I will also mention that Ted Shaw, one of the creators of the Redress Movement, was on our board of directors when we started the organization when he was teaching at the law school here. The Redress Movement is committed to leading a multiracial effort that galvanizes communities to take direct action to redress racial segregation through educating, mobilizing, and shifting the narrative to include the true history of government-sanctioned segregation. She has written extensively about housing segregation and civil rights and testified before the United States Congress as an expert in fair housing law and policy. She is a graduate of Spelman College and Tulane University School of Law. We are so fortunate to have Cashauna with us today. Please help me welcome her.
Thanks so much to Pam and Kristen and to the staff and the board at the Fair Housing Center of Southeast Michigan. I am so honored and pleased to be with you all today. So good morning. Thank you for having me. I will go ahead and get us started with today's conversation, the title of which is Repairing the Harms of Discriminatory Housing Policy and Creating Inclusive Communities. So, as you heard, my name is Cashauna Hill, and I do serve as Executive Director of the Redress Movement. I am going to start by sharing a little bit about the Redress Movement and the work that we do. As you heard from Pam, the Redress Movement was created in response to the publication of The Color of Law. The Color of Law was published in 2017 and takes a look at the ways in which the federal government really worked to seed residential segregation all across the country. When the book was published, it was really the first time that many folks across the country had encountered this history and this information. And so Richard Rothstein, the author of the book, was really struck by the consistent asking of, now that we have this information, what can we do next, right? And so really wanting to build on the momentum of the response to the book, the Redress Movement was created. So the work that we do is based on envisioning a country where our zip code no longer predetermines our life chances, where every neighborhood has plenty of resources for us and our children, and where the opportunity to choose where we live and live how we choose is not limited by bad policy, bad economics, or bad actors. The Redress Movement began organizing and leading efforts to redress residential segregation in 3 cities across the United States initially as of 2022. So we've just been around for a couple of years. I always like to make that clear at the outset. I hear from a lot of folks, oh my gosh, I didn't know anything about the Redress Movement. How did I miss this? You haven't missed anything. It's just been 2 years since we got here. So the Redress Movement is committed to leading a multiracial movement that empowers communities to take direct action that redress residential segregation. We work in deep partnership with local communities to repair the harms caused by intentional policies that segregate communities and continue to segregate communities across the country. As you heard, our work involves educating, mobilizing, shifting narratives, and winning redress victories. I'm based in New Orleans, but we do have team members all across the country, and we're currently organizing, building power, and winning victories in 4 communities across the country. I'll share a little bit more about the work that we're doing in those communities, but we started our work in Charlotte, North Carolina, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Denver, Colorado, and we have recently begun operations as of about 8 weeks ago now in Omaha, Nebraska. So why redress, and what does the term mean as we think about it at the Redress Movement? We define that term as present action to reverse and remedy ongoing segregation. Many of you may be familiar with the idea of redlining maps, and so we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But the image that you see here is the redlining map of Charlotte, North Carolina that was developed by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So the ways in which Redress does our work. Our work in communities centers first on research, and we produce creative materials and educational tools that uncover hyper-local histories and the impacts of segregation in local communities. At Redress, we conduct original database and archival research that provides clarity around the legacy and impacts of segregation in communities across the country. Additionally, Redress organizers work both on the ground and digitally. Our groundwork is a part of a widespread movement for social change, leveraging research to help fill knowledge gaps, and convening groups in the housing space to build a unified base and ultimately to build power. Our digital organizing efforts mobilize interested groups and individuals all over the country to build solidarity and awareness of the Redress Movement and the policies and philosophies undergirding our work. A little about the educational resources that we have published. The Redress Movement conducts policy research that dives into contemporary issues that derive from racial segregation. Topics we've covered in these policy briefs include the inequities and how property taxes are assessed on homeowners, the rise in corporate landlords and exploitative homeowners associations practices. We also take a look at local histories of segregation. Through archival research and anecdotes from the ground, we've started to recount the history of segregation in each of our partner cities, detailing the people and entities involved, the specific areas that were targeted for discriminatory policy, and the impacts that endure today. We've also compiled popular resources and common terms to help folks bridge gaps in knowledge and learn the language circulating in housing justice space today. You can find all of these educational resources at redressmovement.org. And I also want to lift up that we have recently created and published a policy toolbox and community survey. The survey is very brief, just about 6 questions, but it encourages everyone who visits the resource to complete the survey. You'll then have an opportunity to learn about the kind of community in which you live, and then you can explore policies that might work in that specific community type to address and remediate residential segregation. The policy toolbox is something that we're incredibly proud of, and it does remain our most highly engaged resource on our website. I would encourage you all to check it out when you have a moment. So we're first going to frame the history around the conversation. So many of us may be familiar with the idea of redlining, and I'm so sorry to note that my credit to the source of this image has been cut off, but I will share that this was produced by Michigan State University's College of Agriculture and Natural Resources, and I'm sure that many of you are familiar with Michigan State University's Redlining in Michigan project, which is where I grabbed this image. So I want to be clear that across the country there is significant evidence that racially restrictive covenants played a role in segregating many communities before the federal government institutionalized redlining. So to be clear, right, we will talk a bit about redlining, but I want to back the conversation up because many conversations about the harmful impacts of discriminatory policy on our modern housing market and systems, those conversations often begin and have their roots in redlining, but we need to be clear, right, that there were planners as well as people interested in becoming homeowners who were already sort of implementing, right, discriminatory actions in order to keep communities exclusive and exclusionary. So racially restrictive covenants became a way to ensure that communities were white and that people of color did not have access to those communities. Now, from the Federal Housing Administration's inception, the FHA strongly recommended racially restrictive covenants and the use of them. In fact, the FHA's 1934 underwriting manual makes it clear that the federal government was only interested in underwriting mortgages with restrictive covenants in place and only in areas that were adequately protected against, quote, the infiltration of inharmonious racial or nationality groups. The map that you see here is a map that was created by a separate federal agency, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and followed these same racist principles. Now let me first note that this is the map that created the template for redlining Detroit and its surrounding areas. The Redlining in Michigan project does not contain any redlining maps, and many of you may know this, there aren't any that have been found. And so we have to kind of use, right, some of these maps from communities nearby to give a sense of how this scheme was implemented. So redlining gets its name from the red areas on these HOLC, again that stands for Homeowners Loan Corporation. Redlining gets its name from the red areas on these HOLC maps, noting that the most hazardous areas, right, these are the areas colored in red, and these are the areas where people of color were living. Redlining generally refers to any practice that uses or used racist real estate principles to evaluate risk or to make loans. Now, we do place a lot of emphasis oftentimes in housing justice conversations on these HOLC maps. They provide great images, right, of the ways in which the federal government and these entities were valuing or devaluing the lives of actual human beings based on their race. However, it's important to note that the HOLC itself did not implement any of these maps, but the Federal Housing Administration's lending practices were based on similarly discriminatory maps that the FHA created using the HOLC's template and guidance. Now, unfortunately, there's only one official FHA-created redlining map that survives today, and that's actually the map that was used to redline and segregate Chicago. And so often, when advocates and folks who do this work are referring to redlining maps, we're using the HOLC maps as a symbol, right, of the kind of thinking and the kinds of policies that the FHA actually implemented to segregate communities. Now, I want to note that this had a very real impact. This kind of racist, discriminatory risk rating system had a very real and discriminatory impact whose effects we continue to feel today. One widely repeated statistic is that between 1930 and 1950, only 2% of FHA mortgages went to non-white families. Now, many of you are likely very aware of this, but redlining and its effects continue to be felt in communities today. We know that very often communities that were colored in red, in which the federal government intentionally starved of investment, those are the communities today that have the highest poverty rates, the lowest school test scores, and the highest amounts of exposure to environmental hazards. We also know that in many communities, these formerly redlined neighborhoods, if we think about the impacts of the recent COVID-19 pandemic and the ongoing pandemic, those communities were disproportionately impacted. The formerly redlined communities, for instance, in New Orleans, were the same communities where we initially saw the highest rates of COVID positivity, right? And then those were the same communities that initially had the least amount of access to the life-saving vaccines once they were developed and were available. So these harms and the impacts of this kind of discriminatory thinking continues to compound and be felt today. So what does the Fair Housing Act do? We're going to talk very briefly about this actually, which is something that is probably pretty rare for a longtime fair housing lawyer to say. But many of you know that the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. It was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson exactly 7 days after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, that really resonates with me, and I hope it resonates with all of you here in the room today. Given our current political system, I can't imagine a circumstance that would move this Congress, right, to pass monumental civil rights legislation in a span of 7 days. Now, I think it's important to be very clear and to always remember what was happening at the time that the Fair Housing Act was passed. Now, I say that a bit facetiously. I wasn't there, right? I wasn't around at the time, so I don't have anything to actually remember, but I've read a lot, I've seen some videos, right? And even as someone who wasn't there at the time, I'm very clear that this country, neighborhoods across the country were on fire, right, in April of 1968. People were angry, there were uprisings, right? The continued subjugation of people of color was really untenable and it could not be maintained. After Dr. King's assassination, that sort of simmering of, it just rose up, right? People took to the streets, communities across the country were on fire, there was a major uprising all across the country following the assassination of Dr. King. Now, many of you may know that Dr. King had been organizing for several years at the time of his death in support of Congress passing what was then called an open housing law. Dr. King and civil rights leaders, as well as community members from large northern cities, primarily centered around the Chicago area, were really looking to expand equitable access to housing opportunity. Congress, however, had absolutely no appetite to move forward with legislation that would lead to integrated and inclusive communities. That was the third rail of American politics at the time. And again, facing all of that backdrop and that context, after Dr. King was assassinated, right, there were uprisings across the country, and then Congress was finally motivated to act. So the Fair Housing Act was signed into law in April of 1968. There are two goals, major goals of the Fair Housing Act. The first, I think, is pretty widely well known. The Fair Housing Act makes individual acts of housing discrimination illegal. The second goal of the Fair Housing Act, really the second mandate of the Fair Housing Act, is a little bit harder to get at because it requires people actually, right, changing their actions, thinking about the privilege and the benefits that they have access to, and then working, right, to ensure that everyone has access to the same kinds of outcomes. And so that second goal of the Fair Housing Act, the one that's a bit harder, requires local governments to address the legacy of discriminatory housing policy and work to create open, integrated communities. So, if racially restrictive covenants are now legal, they were struck down by the Supreme Court of the United States in a 1948 decision, and obviously were made illegal by the 1968 Fair Housing Act. So if racially restrictive covenants are now illegal and are no longer enforceable, and if redlining is a thing of the past, as many of us think, and it was also outlawed by the passage of the Fair Housing Act, what's keeping our communities segregated? We're going to talk a little bit about that next, and I'm going to spoil the answer, and I'll tell you, communities are not segregated because all the black people want to live near each other. That's not the answer, okay? It's not a naturally occurring phenomenon. It's not just because people don't have enough money to live in gated communities. That's not it. The reality is that middle class and high earning African Americans are more likely to live in a high poverty neighborhood than our poor white people. So again, we have to rid ourselves of the thinking that people are just choosing to live in segregated communities. Now, to be clear, there are absolutely some of us who are going to choose to live in communities that are majority or historically black. But there are others of us who would love the opportunity to choose to live in communities that are well-resourced or that may have more access to opportunity. And so what the Fair Housing Act promises is that people have the ability to choose the neighborhood that works best for themselves and for their families without interference from discriminatory policies or actions. So, the two issues that we are going to talk about that continue to perpetuate inequity today are exclusionary zoning and appraisal bias. So, exclusionary zoning as an indicator of residential segregation. This is a really important point that I always want to make sure to lift up. According to scholars Jonathan Rothwell and Doug Massey, exclusionary land use policies are the single biggest predictor of residential segregation in a community. Across the United States, the same communities that were targeted for federal investment and where white home seekers were readily provided with low-cost, federally backed mortgages simply because they were white, not because they worked harder, not because they were more special or were smarter. White families had access to home ownership simply because of their race. African Americans did not have access to home ownership simply because of their race. That's it, right? And so, these same communities where white home seekers were readily provided with these low-cost federally backed mortgages, these are often the same communities that now have the most restrictive and exclusionary zoning schemes in place. Those restrictive and exclusionary zoning schemes go a very long way toward keeping those communities more white and more wealthy than they might be otherwise. So we have to be clear about the ways in which we are continuing to perpetuate segregation by perpetuating exclusion, by trying to keep, right, opportunities for certain people, keep communities as they are, and keep people out. That continues to perpetuate segregation and compound the harms of redlining and other discriminatory housing policies. So a little bit about appraisal bias here. We're going to talk briefly about 3 different instances of appraisal bias involving black families across the country. Now, I want to start at the outset by saying that none of these instances of appraisal bias that we're going to discuss take place in the South. All of this happens in the northern half of the United States, okay? One of these cases involves a woman living in Indiana. One case involves a couple living in Baltimore, and then one involves a couple living very near San Francisco in the Bay Area of California. So starting with the couple here to the left of the screen. Dr. Nathan Connolly and Dr. Shawnee Mott, they're a married couple. Unfortunately, Dr. Mott actually passed away earlier this year at the age of 47 after a battle with cancer. She and her husband are both PhDs. They were working at the time as professors at Johns Hopkins University. They lived in a majority white neighborhood in Baltimore. And in 2022, my apologies, they were seeking to refinance their home loan. And they received an appraisal valuation of $472,000. They had a sense that this wasn't correct. So they whitewashed their home, they removed all of their family photographs, and they had a white colleague meet the appraiser and pose as the homeowner. The second appraisal came back nearly $300,000 higher at $750,000. How does that happen if not for racial discrimination?
Right.
Now, I've been in a lot of rooms and had this conversation. And I bet somebody in here is trying to figure out a reason that it happened that didn't have anything to do with race. and rather than spending that time and that brain power, I want us to think about how this could have happened due to race and how to ensure that it doesn't continue to happen, right? You know, I've had folks with experience in this area say, oh, well, that only happens with national lenders. It's not true. Oh, well, that only happens with appraisals who aren't from the community. So now homeowners have to make sure that the appraiser who's coming out to their house, who they don't pick, is from the community. I mean, these are impossible barriers and obstacles, right? So we're often spending so much mental energy trying to make something else be the case when we could just focus on what's actually happening. And that's what I'm going to encourage us to do in this conversation, because the reality is, whether or not we think it happens with certain lenders or with certain appraisers, it's happening. And people are being negatively impacted. Families and communities and neighborhoods are being negatively impacted every day. So we'll move on to the Tate Austin family, the second couple at the top here to the right of the screen. Paul Austin and Tanisha Tate Austin were very excited in 2016 to see for sale a home located in Marin City. Marin City is a hilly, historically black community that is in an unincorporated part of Marin County, which is a relatively affluent suburban area just 10 minutes north of San Francisco. Now, in Marin City, there are only about 2 to 3 houses that go on the market for sale every year. So in 2016, Paul Austin and Tanisha Tate Austin saw a listing for a house costing $550,000, and they bought it. Over the course of the next few years, they made significant upgrades to the home. They added about 1,000 square feet to the house. They expanded the living room, and they added a deck to the house that included views of the San Francisco Bay. As the work was ongoing, they decided to refinance their mortgage. They hired an appraiser who was white to come out to their house, and the number came back as $995,000. This unfortunately meant that for this family, their refinance could not be processed because the valuation amount was too low for the loan to make sense for the lender. After receiving that appraisal, the couple decided to do the same thing as Doctors Connolly and Mott did. They whitewashed their home. This meant removing family photos and artwork, books, hair products, anything that might indicate that a Black family lived there. Every time I talk about these cases, I have a moment where I'm just overcome by how much work was involved in doing all this. I live in a house by myself with a 6-year-old and a dog and a cat. Okay, so that's a lot of people actually now that I think about it. But I live in a house with a human and 2 animals. I can't imagine the kind of time that it would take me, and I don't have as much on my walls as I think I should, but I can't imagine the amount of time that it would take me to remove all indications of Blackness from my home. And I've just got a 3-bedroom house. I don't have to go upstairs. I don't have fancy, this stuff that they've got going on in the San Francisco Bay Area. People had to spend hours of their time to do this before they could even start the process. And what I'm also struck by whenever I think about these instances is, what do you tell your children while you're doing this? Now, I've got a 6-year-old. He told me before I came here that one day he's going to have to go on one of Mommy's work trips because he knows a lot about segregation too. And it's true. So maybe I could have this conversation with him about why I was removing things from our house that tells people who we are. But that would be a tough conversation, and it would be one that I don't want to have, and this is what the 6-year-old who already understands segregation. He loves Dr. King. We talk about him a lot in my house. So he's got a foundational knowledge, but I wouldn't want to have this conversation with him. So people are spending time, they are having dehumanizing conversations with their children in order to be able to do this, just to ensure some amount of equity. So, Paul and Tanisha, after whitewashing their home, they asked a white friend to be present at the house and greet the appraiser. The new appraisal came back at $1.4 million, nearly $500,000 than the original estimated value. Now, Paul and Tanisha did sue that appraiser and the company that she worked for, and they did reach a really great settlement. And same with Doctors Mott and Connolly. That case was settled earlier this year as well. But the reality is, it takes years to go through litigation, and you've already had the harmful things happen, right? You've already gone through the hours to remove signs of who you are. You've already had those conversations with your children that you should not have had to have. Moving on to the final homeowner at the bottom of the screen here. So in the spring of 2020, Harlette Duffy, a Black homeowner living in a historically Black neighborhood in Indianapolis, right? Indianapolis, Indiana. No racism there. Right? And I say this as someone who's originally from Portland, Oregon. I spent some time, as Pam said, litigating for housing cases in Portland. I can't tell you the number of times people have very seriously said to me, isn't it great to be living here where there's no racism? And so many of us might have similar thoughts about a place like Indianapolis, right? So in the spring of 2020, Harlette Duffy was feeling that the 2 home valuations that she had received just weren't quite accurate. She was looking to refinance her mortgage, and she had received valuations placing the home's value at $125,000 and $110,000 respectively. She had the white husband of a friend stand in for her during the 3rd appraisal process. She refused to disclose her race or gender and only communicated with the appraiser by email. And so when the appraiser showed up and there was a white man present in the home, they didn't know that that wasn't really the homeowner. And suddenly, the home was worth $259,000. Now, it's not as big a jump, right, as we saw in Baltimore and in Marin City, but home prices in all communities are different. And losing, right, more than $100,000 worth of equity or of value simply based on your race is significant, no matter where you live. Now, Ms. Duffy was represented by the Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana. Paul and Tanisha were represented by the Fair Housing Advocates of Northern California, and Doctors Mott and Connolly were represented by the Rowan Colfax firm out of Washington, D.C. in their litigation. I believe Ms. Duffy, her complaint is still pending with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. It was filed in 2021, and my understanding is that she's still waiting for some sort of resolution. There have been multiple stories in national media over the past several years about bias in the appraisal industry. This is no longer something that is simply happening, that is not having a lot of attention placed on it. You know, I understand that people of color for many years have known anecdotally, right, that this is something that's happening. Many of you may now have an understanding that appraisal bias continues to impact our communities through the significant amounts of research and data that have been collected, continuing to show the harms that appraisal bias inflicts on communities across the country. Dr. Andre Perry with the Brookings Institute has done an incredible amount of research that continues to show that Black neighborhoods, simply by virtue of the people living in them being Black, are losing billions of dollars in valuation, right? We also have to be very clear that this happens to African Americans whether they live in white neighborhoods or in communities of color. The odds, the deck, the game simply stacked against us, no matter what we do, right? You hear all the time that people need to become homeowners. It's the way to build generational wealth. Well, it can be, but what happens when you work hard to become a homeowner, but because you were only able to purchase a home in a predominantly Black community, you don't see the benefit of appreciation? I'll share a little experience that I had myself back in 2021 when we had, record low interest rates. I thought, well, we'll get a little refinance and bring this down, see how it goes. I live in a historically Black neighborhood in New Orleans that is gentrifying. I've made some improvements to my home, was sure that the value would be just fine in order to process the refinance. I had a white appraiser come out to my house. The very first thing he said to me, wow, this neighborhood sure has changed a lot. When I was growing up, people like me knew not to come over here because it was like Vietnam.
Oh, wow.
And I'll tell you, he did not mean because there were a lot of Vietnamese people living there. He hadn't even stepped into my house. He was on the front porch when he said that. My first thought was, oh no, I already knew what I was going to get back, right? And I got back a report saying that my house had increased in value at all. It simply hadn't increased. There was also a report that included incorrect language about the kind of materials used to build my home, and the valuation was clearly incorrect. I'll share that there is really no uniform standardized process for homeowners to move through once they've had this kind of experience. Now, I did raise a fuss. I suggested that folks over there spend some time on Google.com learning about the work that I do. It's very easily available. And I got a call back the next day from a very kind gentleman who was eager to work together to resolve this issue. 2 weeks later, I got a report in my email inbox saying, given these special circumstances, we ordered a drive-by appraisal at your house. Nobody even had to come inside. Just from the outside, we've got $50,000 that magically appeared. Now again, I don't live in Baltimore, I don't live in, the San Francisco Bay Area. That was an incredible difference, right? And so I just want to be clear that this is continuing to happen. It is continuing to impact communities. And unless we are all working together to push for changes to these systems and the way that we engage with them, we're going to continue to see this happen. Now, given all of this attention, HUD really decided to act around the issue of appraisal bias. And I do want to share this update because I do think it's pretty promising. In July of this year, HUD announced a wide-scale investigation and a settlement with the Appraisal Foundation. That's the organization responsible for setting standards and qualifications for real estate appraisers and providing voluntary guidance for all industry valuation professionals. HUD's secretary filed a complaint against the Appraisal Foundation alleging discriminatory barriers preventing qualified Black people and other persons of color from entering the appraisal profession on the basis of race in violation of the Fair Housing Act. I just want to quickly note some statistics. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics 2023 data, the property appraisers and assessors occupation was 94.7% white and 0.6% Black. We did not even make it to 1%. This makes the appraisal industry the least racially diverse industry of 800 occupations surveyed by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. HUD made clear that the lack of diversity within the appraiser workforce can contribute to patterns of misvaluation in communities of color. Yes, it can. And just to take us a little further, making sure we're connecting all the dots, this pattern of undervaluation contributes to the racial wealth gap. Today, the median white family holds 8 times the wealth of the typical Black family and 5 times the wealth of the typical Latino family. And y'all, again, this is not because of differences in education, personal decision making, none of that. We are talking about facts, numbers, what is actually happening. Even if we think that personal responsibility or choices or whatever plays a role here, now all the people of color, every single one, are not making bad decisions that lead to these outcomes. Come on. There's something larger at play. HUD's complaint took a look at the experience requirement that the Appraisal Foundation includes for all of its prospective appraisers. The settlement agreement that HUD reached provides for increased funding for alternative and more inclusive paths for fulfilling the experience requirement. And HUD believes that the new experience requirements will bring us closer to correcting historic discriminatory patterns in the appraisal industry. Now, I do want to quickly note the money that the Appraisal Foundation is required to pay, because as a lawyer, that's very important to me. Under the terms of the agreement, the Appraisal Foundation is required to establish a $1.22 million scholarship fund, which will be utilized to cover the cost of aspiring appraisers to attend a training program, and that program will be designed to provide these alternative pathways to fulfilling that experience requirement. Now, we haven't talked much here about bias in the sales process. I wanted to focus on appraisals because it's getting a lot of national attention. And I just wanted to note how even becoming a homeowner still certainly has many traps and pitfalls for African Americans and other people of color. But we also need to be very clear about the ways in which bias creeps into the sales process. I know the folks at the Fair Housing Center probably have lots of stories about this. I certainly do from my time leading a fair housing advocacy group. We often were receiving calls where community members were dealing with realtors who were saying things like, well, this, you know, with your kids being so small, this isn't the right kind of neighborhood for you. Or, I don't know that you'll feel safe here. Don't you want to look on this side of town that has better schools? So one thing that is very important to keep in mind for those of you that are showing homes or that are realtors, real estate professionals, we really need to be clear that making choices for families, right, about where they should live or where they would fit in can really take us down the path, right, of unlawful discrimination. So we'll talk a little bit more about how everyone can help and efforts that everyone can take. But one thing that it's always important to know for real estate professionals is that you really usually can't go wrong when you're focused on talking about the house, right? The opportunities present in the home, the lovely things about the home, but judgments and comments indicating the value of lack of value or lack of value around the neighborhood, around the inhabitants, around the school, they can continue to perpetuate segregation and certainly can also be unlawful and discriminatory. So I'm going to zoom quickly through the ways in which the Redress Movement is working to address and remediate residential segregation across the country. So we're zooming back out to talk a little bit more about the work of the Redress Movement, and then I will be happy to take some questions. So as I mentioned, we're working in 4 communities. I'm going to take you through Denver, Charlotte, and Milwaukee because we're so new in Omaha, and much of our work there is still focused on community conversations, learning from people what their concerns are, and connecting with others working in the space to develop our priorities in our campaigns. But in Denver, we recently finished some very successful legislative advocacy, including reining in the abusive and inequitable practices of homeowners associations and passing for-cause eviction protections at the state legislature. Now, let me just pause here a little bit on the HOAs in the Denver area. So I learned when I started at Redress just a year ago, and I did not know this despite having practiced law for almost 20 years, but there are several states across the country, a minority thankfully, where homeowners associations can foreclose on homeowners. This is regardless of whether or not a person's mortgage is fully up to date. Now, I do not live in an HOA community, and that is by choice. Some of you may live in those communities, and you may love them. I can tell you, generally speaking, not a great idea for HOAs to be able to foreclose. And what we saw happening in the Denver area is that in one community, which was formerly a receiver community for white residents fleeing the city of Denver, as it began to racially diversify in the 60s and 70s, as people of color are now being pushed out of a gentrifying Denver, they are fleeing right to some of these first ring suburbs that were receiver communities for white flight. And in one community, community members were noticing that the HOA was disproportionately using their foreclosure powers to foreclose on homeowners of color. So we were working to support several families who had been foreclosed on. One woman that we were working to support in the Denver area was a homeowner current on her mortgage. Her foreclosure action began with a $50 fine that she was assessed for having bad leaves sitting on her curb for too long. She was assessed that $50 fee and probably was thinking like I would think, oh, I'll get to that, right? Well, the fees kept adding up, and at some point the HOA's attorney wrote her a letter and said, you have to pay these fees. And then they charged her for the attorney's time to write the letter. And then next thing you know, she owes $3,000. She was then, for bad leaves, that's right, I heard somebody say, we're talking about $3,000 for bad leaves, and we are. And her home was sold out from under her at auction to a local developer. We've been working with her and supporting her for over a year as she tries to gain back ownership of the home that she should still rightfully own. So removing or changing, limiting the ability of HOAs and related entities to foreclose on homeowners was a huge priority in this year's legislative session. And I'm happy to say that we were successful in those efforts. We were able to remove the foreclosure power altogether from metropolitan districts, which are HOA-like entities in Denver, and then significantly limited, and then put in some restrictions and requirements around the HOA's abilities themselves to foreclose. We were also successful in bringing foreclosed eviction protections, which ensure that tenants will not be evicted or won't have a property manager that fails to renew their lease without giving a reason and adequate time to move. In Charlotte, the work that we are doing has really focused on community education, countering the rise of corporate landlords. We've also been connecting with and sharing out and lifting up stories of African American families displaced by urban renewal policies, and then also working to support community members who want to repudiate the racially restrictive covenants that were once governing their neighborhoods. Something that is also really important about Charlotte to point out is that Black and Latinx families are denied mortgage loans at twice the rate of white potential borrowers in that community. Again, that's not due to credit scores. It's not due to just credit scores. It's not due to just credit scores. Even when we control for that, right, white borrowers with similar credit scores still are able to access loans that Black and Latinx folks cannot. So when we take a look at these issues, right, those differences in personal circumstances are accounted for, but when you control for those differences, we're still seeing the same disparate outcomes based on race. In Milwaukee, now Milwaukee's interesting. I like to start here at the top. Now I knew this before I started working at Redress. Did y'all know that the city of Milwaukee, majority of people of color, you're close to Milwaukee, you may know that. A lot of folks, I think, here in Wisconsin, you're thinking about cows, or I don't know, but Black and brown people, not usually top of mind. But they're in Milwaukee. So within the city of Milwaukee, the residents are majority people of color. Now, when we go outside the city and we look at the surrounding county, right, then the scenario is flipped. Majority white in the suburban surrounding county areas. Something else that I think is really relevant to this group of folks and this group of professionals, Milwaukee is second only to Minneapolis as the U.S. city with the lowest Black homeownership rate. So in Milwaukee, you see it right there, 25.2% of Black families own their own homes. That is abysmal. Now, Milwaukee is an outlier even across the country. Across the country, a little over 70% of white families own their own homes. And that number usually holds up in various communities. So across the country, the majority of white families are homeowners instead of renters. Now, when we look at Latinx, Asian, and Indigenous folks, the numbers fall in the 50s, right? But when we get down to African Americans across the country, only a little over 40% of Black folks in this country own their own homes. So we have the lowest homeownership rate of all racial and ethnic groups. And it's important to note that now the national Black homeownership rate is lower than it was in 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed. The Black homeownership rate is lower now than it was in 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed.
What'd you say?
I'll say it again. The Black homeownership rate now is lower than it was in 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed. That's pretty abysmal. And it's really unacceptable. Again, if we're thinking about homeownership as the #1 way of building generational wealth, right? Just people of color in many communities and across the board don't have access to that wealth building tool. And it's not because they don't want to have access, and it's not because they've made decisions that don't allow them to have access to homeownership.
How much
And so-
longer do we put up with this?
Well, we're going to get there. I don't know. That's the question that I have. And so, in Milwaukee, this is an incredibly huge issue. Those, folks there have an understanding that they don't have access to homeownership, and that their access to homeownership looks even worse than it does for African Americans across the country. So, in the spirit of how much longer are we going to put up with this, I'm going to move on ahead to a community that's not putting up with this any longer, particularly when it comes to lack of access to homeownership for African Americans. So now we're going to go all the way back over to Washington State, also a place where there's no racism. I'm from the Pacific Northwest, right? That's how we like to think of it. And so, in that spirit, I think, maybe, on a hopeful note, in 2023, the Washington legislature passed the Covenant Homeownership Account Act. And I always like to raise this as a possibility, right, for actually redressing, remediating the harms of residential segregation and discriminatory housing policy. So the Covenant Homeownership Account Act will set up a special purpose credit program. I know all of my lenders in here are familiar with that concept. So this bill sets up a special purpose credit program through the state's Housing Finance Agency. And the program will provide interest-free down payment loans to anyone excluded from home ownership by racially restrictive covenants, who lived in the state prior to the Fair Housing Act's passage in 1968, or anyone who is descended from someone who did, and meaning someone who's descended from someone who didn't have access to home ownership prior to 1968. So this bill is really designed to provide a benefit similar to what was provided, right, to white home seekers who wanted to become homeowners following the Great Depression. And it provides that financial benefit to people who can show that their families were unable to access home ownership prior to 1968. The Covenant Homeownership Account Act says specifically that the special purpose credit program and these loans are going to be funded by $100 covenant homeownership recording fees that will apply to all real estate transactions across the state. And this means that roughly $100 million will be available for loans every year, and this will mean 2,000 to 3,000 loans of $30,000 to $50,000 each year for community members. I also want to note that the National Fair Housing Alliance, as well as I believe the Homeownership Council of America, have worked extensively with the legislators and the Housing Finance Agency in Washington to ensure that this special purpose credit program will be effective, will target people based on their race, right? People who were excluded from the opportunity to own a home, and to ensure that it meets all necessary legal requirements. So, additional possibility models, sample policy priorities for creating inclusive communities, and wrapping up because I know we have to get to questions. Things like supporting higher density in low poverty neighborhoods, right, to allow for the building of multifamily housing, making sure that we commit public lands in well-resourced communities for affordable housing development. I'm going to tell a little story from New Orleans here about this one. Following Hurricane Katrina, well, let me start here. Many of you may know that New Orleans is a city that is famously built below sea level, right? Now, what folks often don't know is that there are a number of neighborhoods in New Orleans that are actually built on higher ground and don't quite experience significant amounts of flooding. Those neighborhoods are all located along the Mississippi River, including the French Quarter. In New Orleans, we call those communities the sliver by the river, right? Those are the communities that are on a little bit higher ground. Now, prior to Hurricane Katrina making landfall in southeast Louisiana in 2005, there were a number of communities along the Mississippi River that were actually majority black. Immediately following the storm, it became clear that those communities were not significantly impacted by flooding. So instead of 8 feet of water, maybe they saw 18 inches, right? Immediately following the storm, white New Orleanians, new arrivals, people with money, began flooding those communities, no pun intended, that were on higher grounds, which meant the displacement of low-income and African-American residents who had lived in those communities for many years. Now, we're 19 years out from Hurricane Katrina's landfall, and there are no longer any majority black communities along the Mississippi River on that higher ground. They are all now majority white. What that means, of course, is that those folks have had to go somewhere, and most of them have ended up in communities that are much more vulnerable to flooding and other climate risks. What this also means, though, is that the Housing Authority of New Orleans has a very unique opportunity, since they own lands, right, that are vacant in communities that were not well resourced at the time that the Housing Authority maybe demolished the public housing, but now those communities have gentrified. So for several years, the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center, when I was the director, it was then known as the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center, we worked with the Housing Authority to convince them not to sell those valuable lands and to actually rebuild public housing, so that now the folks who live, right, in those units will be living in low poverty, well-resourced communities that have a lot of access to opportunity. The Housing Authority scrapped their plan to sell off all those properties. They've been working to put together development plans. They found developers to partner with. People are finding funding. But I can tell you that 9 years after the Housing Authority agreed not to sell off any of those lands and to actually build public housing on them, not a single unit of public housing has been built. Can anybody guess why? Neighborhood opposition. The white neighbors will not have it. Now, these are lands that the Housing Authority already owns. And they're just trying to fulfill their mission, to do what they are supposed to do on land that they already own. You would think by the neighbors' response that the Housing Authority is looking to set up puppy kicking parties in these communities, okay? And this is a pattern that we continue to see in communities across the country. We have got to get out of the way of the building of affordable and subsidized housing. And let me say this because I know it's going to come up. Well, my property values. Firstly, it's just simply not true that your property values are going to be impacted by the building of subsidized and affordable housing in your community. But secondly, here's the bigger question as I see it. Even if that were true, don't we want to be part of challenging the system that devalues low income and black and brown people so much, such that their very presence in your neighborhood would cause your property value to plummet? If that was the case, don't we want to spend our energy challenging that system? Why would we spend our energy challenging the ability for low-income people and black and brown folks to have homes? Why would we spend our energy challenging who they are or their rights as human beings? So we've got to be clear about what and how we want to fight. And I would urge you all to work to fight for the ability of people to have equitable access to housing opportunity, rather than continuing to support a system that blocks that equitable access to housing opportunity. Additional sample policies. Let's make sure that in gentrifying neighborhoods, for example, we're coupling investments in fresh food, retail, and other amenities with affordable housing investments and things like property tax freezes to ensure that long-term residents can stay and enjoy those new amenities. I hear a lot from community members about their fear of displacement once local governments began to flood their communities with amenities and resources. Once people who have built up communities are starting to experience, right, the benefit of these amenities and these investments, we also have to make sure that folks can stay there And so we need to be protecting the long-term residents through things like property tax freezes and gentrifying communities. How can you help? Consider joining your local neighborhood association, but not if you're going to oppose the building of affordable and subsidized housing. Then forget I said that, okay? But if you want to support publicly and have all your neighbors love you so much, the building of affordable subsidized housing in your community, consider joining your local neighborhood association. As I mentioned earlier, real estate professionals, please ensure that comments are about homes themselves rather than about the community and school district. Sign up to be a fair housing tester. It's always something that fair housing centers need. Here in Michigan, y'all are so lucky to have so many outstanding fair housing centers that are doing incredible work to help your community. If I could be a tester, I sure would, but I can't because every landlord in New Orleans knows me. But it's something I've always been dying to have the opportunity to do. Maybe one day if I ever leave New Orleans, I'm going to be like the #1 tester. But so if you all have the opportunity to do it, so please take that opportunity because I can't. Support zoning reform efforts and consider becoming a redress neighbor. Visit our website and sign up for emails and other action alerts and helpful information. Additional resources. So I want to point you all in particular to Our America Lowballed, which is on Hulu. If anyone hasn't seen it, it's a, I think, 76-minute documentary. I know Tanisha and Paul from Marin City are heavily featured in that documentary. Their story is featured. I really do recommend Tanner Colby, Some of My Best Friends Are Black, The Strange Story of Integration in America. It's not like a scholarly work, it's kind of got like a novel feel. I also know that some folks who do work in this space do not love that book as a resource, but I think it discusses urban planning, residential segregation, in a way that is very approachable. And it is really the story of how a young white man begins to understand segregation and racial discrimination through participating in a busing experience in Birmingham, Alabama. So that is a story that takes place in the South. And there's actually quite a bit of detailing of the history of the use of racially restrictive covenants in urban planning and in planning suburbs across the country. This American Life, the problem we all live with. There's a 2-part podcast episode produced with Nicole Hannah-Jones that I think is outstanding. Of course, The Color of Law. There's also a Segregated by Design video that goes along with The Color of Law. And then lastly, Richard Rothstein and his daughter Leah Rothstein did just last year publish Just Action, How to Challenge Segregation and Act Under the Color of Law, which is a sequel of sorts and provides ideas around the ways in which community members can address these issues. So I thank you so much for your time. My contact information is here, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, and thank you so much for your talk today. I think you gave us all a lot to think over. Well, is it okay with you if I share your slides with folks?
Of course, yes.
Okay, great, wonderful. And now we have some time for some questions. Sandy?
Back to the appraisal issue, more and more appraisals are being done with AI and automated. As you said, you had a drive-by, but even less human intervention. I'm just wondering if you're familiar with does the AI like take historical data and have that built-in bias showing up, or is that bias being removed?
So thank you so much for that question. I really appreciate it. You know, I'm a lawyer, I'm not a tech expert, but let me tell you this. I heard a tech expert say, when addressing this very subject, that when it comes to artificial intelligence, we have to account for the human beings that create those systems, right? And what you said very succinctly, and I'm going to say to you, is that we have to be clear that trash in equals trash out. And so when we are building these systems that are supposed to be more intelligent than people, but we don't account for the historical patterns of discrimination, we're just going to continue to perpetuate them. And that's my concern. There is such an emphasis on trying to remove liability rather than actually trying to ensure that the right things happen, that I think the way that we're using AI now, we're going to continue to see them perpetuate inequity because of what I just said. In my experience, you know, everyone from property management companies to appraisers, right, are moving to this computer or technological model so that they can say, oh, well, I didn't deny you because of your criminal record. The system just kicked it back. Okay, well, that's a horrible excuse, first of all, and I always know that somebody has not talked to a lawyer when they say that. But secondly, you are still responsible for what the computer system is kicking back if you programmed the computer system, or if you're using a computer system that was programmed in a way that means that it has a disproportionate impact on communities of color. So my concern is that there's a move toward the usage of AI, not to ensure that bias is removed, but to ensure that liability exposure is removed. And that means we're not going to create the right kinds of systems that lead to equitable outcomes.
Thank you for saying that. Yes. Next question. Hi, thank you. Thank you for your time and your labor. For the last few years, I've been working on a project that is documenting racially restrictive covenants here in Washtenaw County called Justice Indeed. And we've been trying to engage the community in the documentation process so that we can begin to visualize the deeds and the histories of racial segregation, and also kind of disrupt the myth that our county is this, liberal utopia. One of the challenges as I engage with Black and Brown communities is, why would I care about this? Why do I care to document this history if it's not going to materially change access to housing in those neighborhoods that have been gentrified? So I have a two-part question. One, are you aware, I was so excited to hear about what Washington State is doing, and I hope that our electeds in the room will be inspired by a way we might think about that. So first part of the question is, what other efforts, if any, have you seen like that across the state or are burgeoning? I know our project, Justice Indeed, is connected to mapping prejudice in Minneapolis.
Yes.
But other than the documentation process, I'm curious about if you've heard of others. And then just off the cuff, how are you having a conversation as you tie redlining and covenants? What are those conversations you're having with non-white folks about the importance of this process?
I actually really appreciate that. So I'm going to start with the second question first. Okay. You're right that the conversation often looks different. And, I'll tell you that I don't disagree with, people of color when sort of that's their perspective. The reality is I like to start with the people who have what they need. And I like to start with the people who receive the benefit that other folks didn't get. Okay, and so I think that there is certainly, and let me just say this, the way that we do our work at the Redress Movement in communities of color is around what those communities deserve and did not have access to, right? It's around investment that would address the immediate needs living in those communities. It's about understanding why the communities sort of are the way they are, why those investments were not originally made, and then sort of providing clarity around the ways in which the system works and benefits certain people and then does not work and benefit other people in the same way. And then to your first question around reparative efforts, and that's the way I think of them, yes, I'm aware of several. Something that is I think, similar on a smaller private scale to the Washington legislation is actually taking place in my home community of Portland. And I never talk about Portland this much. I haven't lived there in a very long time. And I've done the majority of my housing justice and fair housing work in the Deep South. But I think one of the things that being in a place like Portland, and maybe like this community as well, in those places that do envision themselves as liberal utopias and maybe a place where there's no racism, there's an opportunity for people to build on those, I guess, I don't want to say self-congratulatory, but that's kind of what I'm thinking of, but to build on this idea that they have around the values that they hold. And what we see happening in Portland is there's actually a group, and I think it's the PDX Solidarity Project or something like that, I think is the name. But there is a group of white homeowners that has come together to specifically work to support white homeowners that want to sell their homes to African Americans who otherwise would not have access. And this is particularly an effort that's focused in the neighborhood in Portland in which I grew up, in which my parents grew up. There are really only 2 neighborhoods in that city where you can find African American folks, and obviously, I mean, I'm guessing y'all know this, there really aren't black people anywhere else in Oregon outside of Portland. And the black folks that are in Portland really were segregated into 2 neighborhoods, right? During the 40s and 50s, and then there was a lot of urban renewal and all these various policies that have been very harmful to the African American community. In, I would say probably beginning in the early 2000s, there was a significant amount of gentrification. And some of you may have seen W. Kamau Bell's CNN piece around gentrification and black displacement in Portland. But there's really been a sort of mass displacement of black folks from the 2 neighborhoods in which we were redlined in the 40s and 50s. And this Solidarity Project is working to sell homes to African Americans who used to live in these communities, right, and no longer will have access to them. So the first person to sell their home using this model is a white woman who decided to sell her home to an African American man for the outstanding loan amount, and that has become a feature of the program. Now, the loan amount was somewhere around, I think, $280,000, but the house was, of course, valued at well over $600,000, and so he came into the sale with several $100,000 worth of equity. That is a reparative, right, program that provides a material benefit similar to the one that white homeowners receive. Now, I'm a lawyer, I've said that multiple times, I just want to note that they are doing this in a way that does not violate the Fair Housing Act. and that involves, right, ensuring that these are private individuals connecting with African Americans. They are not putting the house on the market for sale. There's no engaging of any realtors or agents or things like that. Now, far be it from me to tell people how to violate the Fair Housing Act, but I just want to be clear that this is a program, right, and a model that is being implemented in some communities across the country. It does not, in the way that these folks are running it in Portland, does not violate the Fair Housing Act, but it provides a material benefit, right, again, that is similar to the benefit that white families received to become homeowners in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm going to be much briefer because I know we are just about out of time.
Right, I won't ask a fair question right here. Welcome to Michigan.
Thank you. I love it here.
Glad that you do. I'm Haywood Edwards from Michigan State Housing Development Authority. And this is for everyone in the room. We've just issued an RFP for our analysis of impediments. And the last one that we did was in 2016. And I consider it, along with probably our amazing Fair Housing Center representative, I see Steve, Pam here today, as the one that we did before is woefully inadequate. this year, what I've done, and I put a lot of work into this RFP, to make sure that there are, that it addresses the historical discrimination and the lingering effects of segregation and redlining and so on, that still are considered to be impediments to fair housing choice. The challenge has been identifying companies that have the data piece and the discrimination and the segregation piece.
Oh, yes.
And so, for whoever may be in the room, it's an excellent opportunity, not just here in Michigan, but across the nation, to perhaps create some joint ventures with companies that specialize maybe in you know, the data piece. But, you know, if you are a person who's a DEI person. And so, my question to you is, because we do reference the redress movement in the RFP. I have a page where if they want more information, they can go and search. Does your organization help states and communities with the analysis of impediments at all? That's my question.
You know, I was letting you finish before I said no. And I couldn't say it fast enough, but I'm joking a little bit. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. No. So the reality and the real answer, not the funny one, is that, not the one that's driven by my exhaustion with these processes, is that, you know, that's not the kind of support that we provide. But look, if there is any way that I can be helpful, or any perspective that we can provide, or any resource that we can point you to, or any data that we can provide, if it's something that we're working in or around, then I'm happy to help out in that way. But I absolutely, I think I can say probably pretty definitively that there's really, there's no ability to take that kind of work on at the redress movement as we currently, right, envision the way that we'll work. I think it would require the creation of a whole new program. You could have folks that would do nothing, right, but advise and work around these kinds of planning processes. What I would also suggest is that you may want to reach out to the Fair Housing and Community Development Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that group out of Washington, D.C., but the Fair Housing and Community Development Project has for a long time been kind of one of the go-to resources for jurisdictions that are going through assessment of fair housing or analysis of impediment planning processes. And then you may also want to connect with the folks at PolicyLink as well. They have significant expertise in supporting those planning processes. But I personally have done my time working on those processes. But I'm happy to help out or support in any way that I can.
Thank you, Cashauna. Unfortunately, I want to honor everyone's time today. We were to end at 10:30 to 10:35. You might be around a little bit longer to answer anyone's questions. A little bit longer. Yes, and then we'll be sure to get the slides to you and the contact information. But for right now, can we give Cashauna a big round of applause? There's a table outside with pamphlets and materials on the Fair Housing Center. Any last words?
Cashauna, I'm embarrassed that I'm a member of a race that continues to deny opportunities to black and brown and other marginalized folks. Is anybody else?
All right.
Yes, I'm about to.
Thank you all.
How many other black and brown appraisers are present today? Stand up.
We haven't, I don't know, but we haven't.
Cashauna, how do you see the pandemic affecting the advancement of the Fair Housing Act?
Daniel, we need to wrap this up because we have to be out of the room 5 minutes ago. So
Please do.
Shauna may be able to hang out informally for a few minutes, but that is the end of our
I'm sorry.
the formal proceedings. Thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you next year.